Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now we see in the status quo that illegal downloading is creating very harmful, tangible harms on the music industry, especially the musicians, the composers, the lyricists themselves. And as the government will take the stance that we will continue to fight against these intellectual property theft and the illegal downloading that's happening. We will take all measures to do that. One of those measures is implementing this policy to compensate the music industry for the losses that arise from illegal downloading. We believe that through this policy, we will be able to decrease the substantial harms that are coming from illegal downloading in the status quo. And the government is taking the stance that it is taking all means to try and reduce the substantial harm that come from illegal downloading. So, as the Prime Minister, I'll mainly do two things. First of all, I'll contextualize what's happening in the status quo. I'll mainly talk about two arguments. The harms that are specifically coming on the music industry. That'll be our first argument. Second, I'm going to justify why and when does the government compensate a group of people, and why it is justifiable for the government to compensate these musicians and lyricists. Third, my Deputy Prime Minister is going to talk about the further social ramifications that exist when this policy is implemented. So our goal is to incentivize and allow these musicians to express their true art and individuality and to enhance the benefits that the public receives from listening to this music. Now, to briefly define the motion. Basically, who is the music industry? We're going to define it as these composers, the lyricists, the musicians, the ones that actually produce the music, the substantial music that the public benefits from. Why? Because these people are the essential creators of music that people benefit from. We believe that by directly, financially helping and compensating these people, the core of the music industry, the people who actually create the music, we believe that we will be able to reduce the harms that come from illegal downloading in the first place. So,
Sir,
yes?
when you're talking about incentivizing these artists to actually make music, they actually have other incentives, right? Like artists want to become famous, they get sales from concerts, they have very many incentives.
Okay, I'll talk about this in my first argument and why these musicians have to resort to concerts and all these other means that they talk about, which is not sufficient. So moving on to my first argument, the harms in the music industry. We see that illegal downloading is so rapid that it does not give opportunity for these musicians to earn even the slightest money possible. And you talked about, like they cannot concerts. Well, let's divide it into two parts. First of all, in the case of popular artists that are already famous. Second, in the case of unpopular people. In the case of popular people, they have to rely on these, concerts and other ceremonies when essentially their main source of income should be directed from the music that they're actually creating. We believe that the fact that these people actually have to resort to these other means that do not bring substantial income is a result of this rampant illegal download and the harms that come from it. That these musicians simply cannot earn the slightest money in order to sustain a living. Especially in the case of unpopular artists, we see that these people are simply marginalized. That even if they create the music, even when they try to express their individuality, that's simply because of illegal download. They do not earn any sort of income in the first place. So we see substantial harms. That first of all, for these unpopular artists, music is not created in the first place. Second, even if it is created, it is not a direct expression of their individuality and the music that they truly want to express. It is rather them having to resort to what the music companies demand, and that will be further elaborated by Deputy Prime Minister's speech. But we see that these harms that are coming from the music industry clearly deters these musicians and the lyricists and the composers from producing the music that truly expresses their individuality, or that music itself is simply not created because there is no financial incentive in the first place. We see that because of this intellectual property theft, its harms are not allowing these musicians to simply breathe in the music industry. Let's move on to the second argument. So, now that I've explained the substantial harms that come from it, why should it be the government, the actor, to compensate these people? So when does the government compensate certain groups of people? When these certain groups are actually marginalized, just because of their occupation, but actually when the people benefit from it. A parallel example is war veterans, Mr. Speaker. These people put their these people put their lives at stake to defend the country and to save the general public. We believe that in the same sense that these musicians are actually creating music that benefits the public as a whole, but are not being compensated at all from the government. And we believe that in these kind of cases, it's perfectly justifiable for the government to specifically target and compensate these groups of people directly, so that they can one, further enhance and continue the occupation that they have without having to be unjustly discouraged from creating music. Second, we believe that we can further enhance better music and more music that the public will clearly benefit from. So we see that when these certain groups are actually benefiting the public with their occupation, but just because of the characteristics of their occupation and what illegal downloading is happening, when they are marginalized and when they do not earn the income that they deserve, we believe that it is justifiable for the government to directly compensate these musicians, lyricists, and composers. So what are the substantial benefits that can come from when the government compensates them? We believe, Mr. Speaker, that this is just like the concept of positive externality, Mr. Speaker. We believe that when there is a possibility for these musicians to create more and better music and enhance the general benefits of the public, when this is not happening because there is a financial barrier that divides the public and the composers, we believe that this positive externality is not reached in the first place. We believe that when the government financially incentivizes these and enables these composers to actually express their individuality without having a constant financial burden, we believe that we will be able to enhance this positive externality, and that the public will be able to enjoy more and better music. Parallel examples of this is that the government often intervenes when there is a positive externality, when the public can enjoy more from it, when the government finances the producers of that positive externality, but they don't because the producers simply do not have the financial incentive to do so. For example, let's say I have flowers in the garden and people walking by benefit from it, but I do not have the incentive to create a whole flower shop and thousands of flowers, even if it because I do not have the financial incentive to do so, because it's expensive for me. We believe that it is the same thing in the case of these artists when they want to produce music, when they want to express their individuality, and when the public can clearly benefit from it. When this does not happen because of the financial barrier, we believe that it is justifiable for the government to intervene. So, Mr. Speaker, when we see these substantial harms on the music industry, when we see that by implementing this policy, that composers and the public can all benefit from it, we believe that it is absolutely right to impose this movement.
Okay, I thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and now invite the Leader of the Opposition to open their case.
Ladies and gentlemen, the government today came up here and tried to tell us that there are no existing incentives for people to actually contribute to the art industry. We believe that this problem that they phrased for you, about how we actually need to incentivize people to actually contribute to art, is one that does not exist, because there are many existing incentives within the status quo. And furthermore, using this source of compensation as a way to actually plaster over the problem of piracy in the status quo is something that actually goes against their incentives to stop piracy and to regulate the problem. So let me start with a couple of rebuttals first. Firstly, there's the point that they gave you about how we want to actually use compensation to decrease the harms. Now, we recognize that these artists are actually not making as much money as they would otherwise. However, this is not exactly a harm. It's not the fact that they're actually experiencing the harm. It's more of a lack of benefit. So they're kind of conflating the two and not telling you about the significance. Now, what we see for you is, it's not just that we compensate for every harm that every person experiences within society. It's that culpability is necessary when the government actually goes in there and tries to tell you that we're going to pay you for this. Now, why is culpability lacking in this situation? Why is there actually no responsibility? What we see is that it goes to the nature of regulation. The solution that they have proposed to continue in their model is that they're also going to continue regulating the problem of piracy. Now, when it comes to regulation by its very nature will fail in certain circumstances. There's no way for you to completely stamp out this problem in every single case. Therefore, the very nature of regulation tells you that just because some music is being pirated does not mean that the government is essentially not doing this job. I will be telling you more about this in my substantive point about the role of government. Let's talk about their main goal, which is actually to incentivize the music industry to actually make music. Now, we love music. We think that music should be made. But we think that music actually is being made because of other incentives that exist within the status quo. Now, there are two types of artists that we're going to characterize for you. There are people who are actually getting into the music industry to make a living, and there are people who are doing this because they actually want to contribute to art and become a great artist. Now, within those who actually want to make a living, we see other sources of income. Now, we told you the example of concerts, sure, that's one big source of income, and they told you that this doesn't go to the source of the music. We don't see the logic in this, because the concert exists because you're playing the music that your fans love. Therefore, it essentially contributes to your desire to actually fundamentally motivate people to contribute to music, as well as continuing to allow these artists to actually get income from the work that they're making. Yes?
Lack of benefit that happens when illegal activities are actually harms.
Right. Well, what we were telling you is that it's not just about whether there's harm or not. We don't always compensate people when there is harm. We need there to actually be culpability before we pay them for something. Now, let's go back to what I was telling you about the two types of artists. So for these people who are making a living, it's not just about concerts, there are also other things. These people want to become famous because when you're a famous person, you don't really need to pay for things anymore. So these are the incentives that we actually see within the status quo for people who want to become artists, even though there is piracy. Now, secondly, about these people who want to contribute to art, we say essentially your model does nothing to further incentivize them because they don't really care about making money. All they really want to do is just make art just because they love music, just like we do and we do. So let's go to my substantive point about the role of the government. No, thank you. So about the role of the government, we have this confliction between regulation and compensation. In the status quo, we regulate this harm that you're talking about, the harm of piracy. Now, why do we regulate? We regulate because precisely we see the harms that you see. These harms in society that actually cause people to not get the money that they deserve. Now, when we see these harms, we want to regulate that harm. Sure. And regulating is fine. This is what the government should be doing. But when you take a step further into compensation, that's where it actually becomes not only not feasible, but also principally wrong, something that is wrong on its principle. Now, it's not only about the feasibility of paying so many people so much money, it's also on this principle basis about how mechanisms should be independent from governmental interference. We see that in this situation, we don't want the government to actually become the middleman between the artist and his fans. We don't want the government to have to intervene in every situation. What we want is for the government to actually find a substantive long-term solution. Or what we want is for the music industry to develop such a solution by itself, which is something we actually see in the organic development of the music industry, as will be discussed by my deputy leader of opposition. Now, what we see is that the effect of such compensation on the perception of the government is also something that is harmful. Because basically what you do when you pay someone for something that basically what you're doing when you're paying for this is you're taking responsibility for the harm. You're basically telling these people the reason why you're not getting money, that's because the government did something wrong. And we believe that this is actually the wrong message. It's not only inaccurate, it also creates a problem within the status quo. So what we see is that it's inaccurate because of precisely what we told you about the nature of regulation. Because regulation, there's always going to be mistakes. When the government is doing its job, it's many, many jobs, eventually it will slip up. There are ways in which people will be able to pirate no matter what we do. And because of that, we believe that the government cannot take culpability for such an act in such a way that actually tells them every time that someone pirates your music, I'm doing something wrong. That is something that is wrong. Yeah, go ahead.
We're not blaming the government for not being able to regulate. We're saying that the government can provide incentives for the musicians to create better music.
Okay, thank you for that. We understand that you're not blaming the government, but that's the problem, because you need to blame the government if you're actually going to compensate the victims. Let's talk about why. So that not only is the case within the status quo, but also it's principally true that when the government compensates someone, there's the perception that the government did something wrong, and there's the reality that the government is actually admitting that. Why? Because within the status quo, if the government actually went out of its way to compensate you whenever you break your leg, for example, then that is a problem. That's not something that we do. We don't want to take responsibility for everything bad that happens in your life. Just because these artists are not making as much money as they would have otherwise, that is not a reason for us to step in there and give them money. That is simply not the situation. Yes, closing.
What about the vast majority of artists who aren't famous and can only make a living by selling their CDs?
Right.
What are you
Thank you
going to
for
do
that.
there?
Yes, thank you for that. I actually forgot to mention that. So yes, back to my rebuttals for a quick second. I wanted to talk about this because they basically mischaracterize the entire music industry for you. Because what they're saying is that you actually require a lot of capital, or like, we already told you that there are incentives, but there's also a lack of requirement for capital. All you really need is a guitar and a video camera now. There's YouTube. No, come on guys, this is false. Like in the modern world, you don't really need much more than your own hands, or your own voice for that matter, if you want to make music. These are things that are not necessary. Furthermore, in order to publicize, in the modern world, through the evolution of technology, we see Psy, the guy who actually opened up this entire motion, got famous simply because his video was put on the internet. It doesn't require much more than that. We see little girls singing songs on YouTube that become, videos that receive millions of views, and they become famous, and they go on to our shows. This is the process by which artists actually receive recognition. Okay, so what have we told you today? We've basically rebutted their entire point about how we need to incentivize these artists. We deny such a requirement. We don't think there's actually a problem with there not being enough artists who want to make music. And we don't think that there's a requirement for these artists to actually have capital. Furthermore, we've told you about how this actually undermines the role of the government and extends it beyond regulation to compensation. And we see there being a requirement for there to be culpability before we compensate people who are not getting as much money as they otherwise would get. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thank the speaker for her speech, and now I invite Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not a very fan of the music in itself. I only often use the music, but I do believe that the government should have the compensations rights when there's a problem existing in the status quo, disregarded, accepted by the opposition side in today's debate. At first, largely, we should look at it. We clearly don't get what the opening opposition is trying to achieve in this debate. They accepted the problem existing with regards to the legal downloading, but they never give you a clear idea of what they're arguing for. Do they argue for illegal in itself, or compensation is not justifiable, or how are they protecting this particular individual who is harmed by their idea? No plans whatsoever in this idea. First, I'm going to give you 3 responses to rebuttals on their side of the house. Defend our King's case. Third, move on to argument 3, the rates of change of musicians with regards to ramification. First of you, with regards to rebuttal. Their first idea was that there's other forms of incentives, so therefore there's other alternatives available for you to accept, therefore you can do whatever you want. Wrong assumption. We clearly told you that particular incentives are not no more called incentives. It's a coerced decision because you have no source of illegal no source of your revenue because there's illegal download. Because of that, you're forced to move into areas, whether they're going to think about in content or in what the other areas, unnecessary advertisements, unnecessary shows that you have to participate and to show up. It's famous musicians going into other areas in order to make sure that they get some form of money. That's a particularly false question which hurts the music industry, disregarded by their senators. Second, regardless of whether they're just or whether they're rich or poor, we think that there need to be a just compensation of a right amount of work that you do. So if you have to provide this particular benefit, a social benefit, then you are entitled to that particular amount of compensation, disregarded by their senators. Second, rebuttal. Thank you, ma'am. They basically told you that the role of government is to not to intervene in all forms of harm. Basically, that's what the opening of government tries to attack in this particular idea. No, government does not necessarily need a culpability to write. It does not give you a liability to do so. Just because someone is being culpable doesn't necessarily mean the government should do it. But exactly the reason that we're trying to propose is that because there's a harm existing status quo, government exists to defend its own people. Government exists to defend the particular social classes in this debate. No, thank you. But there's justification to do so. We give you clear explanations how, in the concept of war veterans, where the concept of government people or soldiers has fought for the benefit of society and security, government to compensate. Especially regardless of temporary workers. If the government is temporarily unemployed in some sense for a long period of time, government provides financial subsidies. They didn't have the culpability to it, but they still subsidize particular individuals and righteous compensations to that. No, thank you. Now there comes the idea of technological development of YouTube and YouTube style. 2 responses. No, it does not necessarily make you any cheaper to make music in the first place. Why? Because making the process of music, I'm not mentioning musicians and composers, but it requires a lot of recordings, requires a lot of intensive works, it requires a lot of musicians in itself, not necessarily about to it. Second response is that even if that's true, they still get no money out of that particular area. Just because you post it on a YouTube doesn't necessarily mean that you'll automatically get profit out of the music. And what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, we were talking about the organic things that actually happen after you get famous. People want you to come on their shows, they give you free clothes, these are all benefits.
Wouldn't it be better if they get compensated of their particular music in itself? They get famous for that, at the same time they do get compensation of their particular idea of music themselves, not only about shows which we're trying to prevent in this particular debate. Second, moving on to particular ideas of reconstructing what the Prime Minister had already told you enoughly, beautifully in today's debates. First of all, he provided the concept of need. The concept of music industry, basically related to musicians and composers, are not getting enough. So therefore, they are resorted to force alternatives, whether these people wanting to call it incentives, in a particular idea. No, thank you, ma'am. Second, we tried to explain to you clearly that their own form of intellectual property rights, in a sense of content, are not being substantially compensated enough. And all societies, regardless to it, your ideas, your contribution to society should be compensated, and no one said. Second, he already smartly enough told you when this government do actually compensate its people. First of all, you say when such a group is marginalized by economic reasons, that's particularly harmed by economic reasons, government does have certain ideas. As we gave you concept of war veterans, which was not rebutted by their exactly house. Second, when the causes are created by the actions of the public itself. When the public do benefits from it, and the public do get benefits from it, then there's just implications to it. They go to public custodians and say, so why don't public pay it? Two response. No, the public is not paying. That's why we want to have this motion. Second response is that government and public are same entity. People pay taxes, therefore there's enough justification for government to spend and utilize the money to benefit the public. No, thank you, madam. Sit down. Now, let's look at the concept of the third argument, new contributions coming from this bright deputy prime minister. First of all, I'm going to talk about the breaks of chain within the musicians. As we told you clearly before, the lack of financial independence by these musicians themselves are forced to move into chains of a music industry in general. What we call it is a lack of revenue itself. They're locked up in a mega, entertainment corporations like SM Entertainment in Korea, JYP Entertainment in Korea. I don't know where Japan is, but probably there's something that exists largely out there. I'm not a fan of Korea as well. But basically, these mega corporations are locked up into the particular musicians, and they tend to cause this massive amount of problems, and where they're forced to do a show regardless of their will. They're forced to do a music that they don't particularly like because of that mad corporation. So thank you, Matt. Because it's all reasons that contain to it on the basis of underlying this issue is because there's a lack of financial independence of these musicians. Since they're not financially independent in themselves, they're forced to lock up into music industries of mega corporations. Now, what can the government model actually solve? We don't necessarily believe that the government can solve everything, but we do believe that just compensations were able to make sure these musicians at least get some form of economic independence in general, therefore able to exercise their own free will against the slave contract, against SM Entertainment, against this JYP big corporations as in general. We're breaking that particular chain is important. We can't say that it certainly breaks 100% sure, but we do believe that the fundamental reasons it can do, or with regards to that, allows people to act on themselves or financial incentives. So, largely, what does opening government try to do within this debate? Opening government wanted to state one thing very clear. We wanted to fix illegal download. That's our best option. It's impossible. But since the problem we can't do it right now, even on our current technology, it's been difficult to do so. By that, during a duration of time, musicians are getting hurt. They're doing what they call it incentives. Third, we want to protect that, just compensation is needed. Three things. Need, when the government help, third, breaks of change, third, opening government takes to this. Thank you.
I thank Deputy Prime Minister for his speech, and now I invite Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Before I move on to my substantives, and other rebuttals will be integrated with substantives because there are quite a few. So first of all, they are questioning our stance in this debate, right? We are arguing against using the government to give charity to failed artists and the music industry. We say that it harms the promotion of arts, creativity, and innovation that will go go into my substantives later on. We see that the government should not be made to compensate for these particular industries, and that is not the role of the government to actually have to pay for the failings of particular industries, because it's simply not their purpose to do so. We say that we never really understood why, they never really clarified to us why it is that the government should target this particular music industry to prop up, right? Why is it exactly that these governments need to support this music industry? We say that we say that bigger issues like even bailing out banks are something that is controversial, something that is still debated upon. So why in particular the music industry requires such particular attention by the government? And we say that on our side of the house, we say that it shouldn't be the case, because we do not want a government to be propping up industries. We want a free market to exist within the society, whereby the industry itself finds its own solution to its own problems that will lead to a more permanent and long-term solution overall for that industry. We say that we don't need the government to always have to buffer for everything that goes wrong within that industry. We say that the industry should be more creative and innovative to find solutions for themselves that will work and change the direction of the industry in the long term. That's what we're arguing for. And we also say that we also do not see why musicians would be satisfied with governments paying them money because their albums don't sell. We say that musicians derive satisfaction from having their albums sold. Under your model, ladies and gentlemen, the government compensates for CDs that are never going to be sold because of illegal downloading. We don't see how any musician would derive the satisfaction from the government having to give them charity because they cannot sell their music. We say that is not the kind of promotion of arts that we want in this debate. So what do we want in this debate? Moving on to substantive. We say that the music industry has evolved over the years with the advancement of technology and the internet. More people have access to things like YouTube. Random singers who, some of them can't even sing, going on YouTube and posting videos of themselves singing. We see that the exposure to music has been very vast with the advancement in technology. And we see that the artists and the music industry is beginning to accept reality, that there are more and more people downloading music off the internet, be it illegally or legally. They're already accepting the shift towards the technological advancement that we're talking about. And we see that the music industry has to evolve beyond that barrier. And we see that this motion hampers evolution of this music industry towards a different direction, making companies less innovative and less motivated to promote artists. Because we say that on the internet, anybody can be famous. Anybody has the freedom to express their individuality. If these are the musicians that we are talking about, they have no problems under the status quo, because they can simply post music on YouTube. They can simply perform on the platforms that the government already provide for them in parks, in sidewalks and all that. If it's about expression of music, that's not a problem in today's debate. The problem in this debate is about profits. These artists making money, right? So we say that the music industry has already accepted that the internet has already kind of like driven off sucked off some of their profits from CD sales maybe. So they turn to more innovative means. What kind of music sells today? What shapes the market of today? We see that people have already gone beyond like listening to good singers. They're embracing more, they have bigger expectations when it comes to music. You want someone with personality, like Lady Gaga, who's a style icon. You want someone who has beyond just like vocal abilities to actually succeed in the music industry. And we see that the market is already determining, is already moving in that direction. That's why people with the X factor generally make it more in the music industry. We say this is good for creativity and innovation in the music industry. Why? Because these music industry would then target the people who, if they do really want to make money out of music, make money, not just express themselves individually, they can just play the guitar and go online. But the thing is, if they really want to make money, they will diversify their talents, they would resort to different means in order to be able to appeal and reach out to a vast majority of the public. How? You have like artists who go into like dramas, in the case of Korea, like singers who go into TV dramas, for example. You have people who become really fashionable stylists. You have people who go into diverse, different industries, and this is very good in the promotion of the arts, which is what we are advocating for, right? A better promotion of the arts. We see that your model entirely hampers that. So before I move on, I'll take you.
Thank you. Why are we forced to find that particular alternatives when the current status quo is unjustifiable?
Why is the current status quo unjustifiable? I don't understand your point. Because we say that right now is good for organic evolution of these companies. We don't see why the government has to buffer for everything that is wrong with the industry under the current status quo. We see that they're already finding solutions to these problems we're saying that the current market already has a change in their expectations and demands of the music industry anyway. So we say there's no point whatsoever for you to actually make the government give charity to those people who fail to actually appeal to the market as it is, to the market expectations and demands that we see under the current status quo. So we say that the motion reduces the incentive to resort to these creative means that we're talking about. It reduces the incentive in the diversification of the arts. It reduces the incentive for these people who really are intended to go for the profit-making part of the music industry to actually do more, to appeal to public, to actually inspire more people when it comes to when it comes to artsy stuff like Lady Gaga and her weird fashion sense that helps her sell albums, by the way, and CDs as well, because people look up to her. So on my second point, on how the motion actually reduces the incentive for the government to stop piracy and illegal downloading, which is basically what their problem is. They're talking about how piracy and illegal downloading is so bad, but they never told us how they are going to solve the problem. Because when the government gives compensation, people can still illegally download music, right? So how does it solve the underlying problem that you're talking about? So we said that basically what you're doing is you're putting a plaster over the issue. You're just covering up the issue with money. You're basically buying the music industry into not complaining about how there are not many money through CDs and profits. We say that this is not good in the long run because it actually reduces the incentive for the government to tackle the issue head on, and it reduces the accountability and responsibility that the government needs to take. They think that, oh, the problem can be solved with just giving them money. We're just going to compensate them and that's it. People can still freely, illegally download, they're happy. Music industry is happy because they get money, and we are generally happy, nobody's complaining. But we say that's not the kind of responsible governance that we are actually looking at, right? Because we don't see why the government has to go to the extent to actually do this when we don't see any benefits coming from this other than making the music industry people happy. So this is not what good governance is, ladies and gentlemen, and we don't stand for it. So ladies and gentlemen, what have we told you so far? We talked to you about how their motion completely hampers the promotion of the arts, and we also talked to you about how the government should not be the ones to actually buffer for anything that goes wrong within an industry, and we believe in free market audience. With that, we're very, very proud of those.
Okay, I thank the speaker for her speech. And now invites members of the government.
May I start?
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, basically the logic from opening opposition was that Bill Gates should never ever be unhappy about him losing and having no profit because he already has enough money. If you're making enough money, it's okay for you to have loss. We completely disagree with this principle coming from the opposition side. And also we think that not only are they neglecting the principle of fair competition in the status quo, but they're also bringing much harm to the society, and especially to music industry. And that's going to be our 2 points of extensions of commercialization of music, which is polarization of revenue, and then secondly, better protection of intellectual property rights. But before I move on to my extensions, let me just briefly touch upon what the opening opposition has said. So they basically came up to the podium and started arguing it's a lack of benefit and not a specific harm. 2 points, Mr. Speaker. Number one, lack of benefit is actually a harm if you are losing that benefit because of an illegal activity there. Secondly, we think that lack of benefit equals loss, right? So if your loss is happening at one of the biggest ways of your income, we think that it's a detrimental thing, no thank you, to the industry itself. But moving on, they also talked about how there are incentives for these people to make music anyways. And their logic was that they can earn money by having concerts. Rebuttal to this is that not all musicians are able to hold concerts and able to make money by having concerts, but we also think that not all musicians should be forced to hold concerts anyways. We don't think that this is the nature of musicians itself. This will be dealt on in my substantive later on. But also, they just said that, what if some people just love making music? That will be their incentive. Well, we think that yes, they may love the process and outcome of making music itself, but that doesn't mean that profit loss is justified. We think that it goes for everyone who enjoys their job. If I enjoy my job, that doesn't mean that me getting my loss of profit is justified because I love doing my job. Alright, sit down. And they also talked about how not all losses are worth compensation. We think that compensation is actually very necessary when the biggest way of revenue is illegally damaged. And they also said that why is government getting the blame? It's sending wrong message to society that government is getting the blame. Number one, Mr. Speaker, we think that government, although we shouldn't blame government all in all, government does hold certain responsibility in terms of not securing fair competition for these industries. If they are not doing their best job, they need to be incentivized to do so. And this will incentivize the government to do so, as I will be explaining later on in my substantive as to why it's better protection of IPR. But secondly, we also think the government sends positive message to society that they will be dealing with intellectual property rights. Intellectual property are not subject of theft anymore. That's the rightful message that government wants to send in government bench today. Sit down. And they also have this argument about how music industry will have to find their ways to fight this loss. It's their burden. Mr. Speaker, basically under your model, what is happening is that the only way music industry will ever find their way is to all turn their musicians into Lady Gagas. We don't think that's the healthy image of music industry in the status quo. It's very, very wrong for your government to say that you're having illegal profit loss, but deal with it. That's the wrong message the government is sending to a specific industry. But moving on, they also said that listeners want and expect more from musicians, like Lady Gaga. 3 points of rebuttals under this. Number one, we think that they never proved why being a star should be the prerequisite to be a successful musician. But number two, why is that change and evolution something that is beneficial? Why does the government need to endorse this kind of change? They never actually proved why the government needs to support this evolution. But moreover, we think that this is going to further create polarization and commercialization of music industry, as I will be dealing in my substantive. And also about the moral hazard of government, this is directly going to be rebutted by our second extension. So, as you have been anticipating, our extensions. Before that, yes?
The benefit of actually doing this organic development is because it's the only permanent solution to the problem that you're trying to deal with.
No, actually that was an assertion. I really don't know how to rebut to an assertion, so let's look at the extensions first. Alright, number one, commercialization of music and polarization of revenue. We think that, the OG depicted some of the consequences of revenue loss for musicians, but a unique contribution coming from the closing government is that we will bring you the mechanisms of how commercializations occur. Why government not securing the means of profit and compensating will lead the music industry to commercialize itself. First things first, why is commercialization bad? We think that commercialization exists because too much supply is being given to limited trends and limited types of demand. For example, South Korea has witnessed over 60 different newborn idol groups this year alone. And the reason being is that not because, people want similar tunes and similar melodies, but because this limited number of limited types of demand is being met by too much supply. We think that similar tunes by limited number of popular composers and gigantic entertainment group is not beneficial for music industry as a whole, because the music becomes more about looks, because diversity is lost, and number of new musicians decrease, and also polarization happens. We think that no longer in the status quo you can earn money without having a gigantic label like SM, like Sony Music. But also, we think that people can no longer access to different music and diverse music. So my second level of analysis, why commercialization happens and why it will be worsened under their model. We think that it's not only about the demand and supply mechanism, but it's also because government does not protect the biggest channel of profit earning for these industries. Loss occur, and when loss occur, music industry finds other ways of revenue, as they said. Now, if music don't sell, what sells, Mr. Speaker? Sex sells. And that's why music is being commercialized. Because if music, the tune, the voice, the melody, and the lyrics themselves won't make enough money, music industry turns to external measures, concerts, suggestive dance moves, shorter clothes. And we think that this is extremely unhealthy for music industry. Because government compensating for the lost revenue will actually save more musicians from engaging and resorting to different ways to earning money. Musicians can live happily and with money by fulfilling their job, which is to create music. They no longer need to have magnificent looks to make money, Mr. Speaker. But our second point of extension about better protection of intellectual property rights. This is going to be brought to you in two levels of analysis. Number one, government, and number two, citizens themselves. So number one, we think that the government is now being held liable for the loss of these industries, and that will actually incentivize the government to improve detection and abolishment of illegal downloading as a whole. They know that they need to pay somehow if loss happens. So that will actually push the government and incentivize them to have a better mechanism of detecting illegal downloadings. But moving on to our second point of analysis about citizens themselves. We think that the public awareness of intellectual property right will actually increase. People resort to illegal downloading right now because they think if they don't pay right now, they won't have to pay forever. Now what happens under our model is that now even if you choose a short-term way out, short-term option of not pay, you know that your tax money is going to be compensating for the loss of that industry somehow. And when that happens, citizens themselves are becoming very much aware that the intellectual property rights is something detrimental they will have to pay anyways in the long run. That's the kind of society that we want to promote, where intellectual property is not being stealed. We beg to propose.
I thank Member of Government for her speech. And now let's hear from Member of the Opposition.
Finally, in the last speaker's speech, in the last minute, I hear some possible benefits of their policies that may bring to industry society. But the two possible benefits that they claim but not really explain can't be rebutted first by my speech. Firstly, they said this kind of compensation will push the government to regulate the industry, and in that case, this kind of piracy won't be happening in the future. We don't see the logic link between these two because this kind of compensation already exists if your policy taken place, and in that case, the governments actually do not really have this kind of mechanisms and this kind of incentives to do it furthermore, right? Because they already do it and already pay the industries. They don't really see the necessity when your policy taken place that they will do furthermore and use more money to put in this endless hole actually you are creating, right? So secondly, they say when this kind of policy exercises, citizens in the society will view this as a kind of warning that if you download it now, you are paid in the future. The problem is that people don't perceive this action in this way. People perceive as, I will pay it anyway. My taxpayers' money will pay it anyway. So why I download it more and then share by everyone else's? So the more I download, the more benefit I gain, and then the benefit I get will be paid by everybody else. Why should I constrain and control my own eager and to download free music in the first place, right? So this kind of message you're sending is not really effective by your policy. That's the only two benefits that I heard from the proposition. Now, move on to the extended part that I want to discuss about today's issue. Firstly, the upper house and the previous speakers both talk about different issues. They are majorly talking about two types of people in the music industry. First is the kind of commercialized stars that dance and taking advertisements that gain money through a team, a whole package of teams. So in that case, this kind of industry, this kind of stars are actually working together as a team. They don't, for example, if one part of the financial resources don't gain money, the other part gains, they share this kind of benefits for everybody because they work as a team. So when the downloading of their savings do not really gain music, they do it by other means, just like the previous speaker might have told. But the problem is that you actually do promote different kind of mechanisms. You also mentioned about the other part of the industry, which is the composers themselves. They don't get independence and they don't gain the kind of financial benefits from the whole package of this music industry, which is not true. The why they come up as a team is because they do it as a whole. So it's just like an international company that although they may sacrifice certain parts of the sectors in order to gain the whole the benefits for the whole team. And in that case, this kind of benefits were reallocated to each part of the team, right? That's how today's business run. Admitted that. Today's business cannot be run by an individual that is simply do it by their own power. It has to be a group work that can generate the maximized benefits. Okay.
So wouldn't it be better if we clearly told you that the pie would be much more bigger as in the current status quo?
Okay. The problem is that, firstly, you don't really tell me why the current mode is really we told you that when there's the problem of today's society of music industry that we want to both satisfy the demands of the consumers, at the same time we want to guarantee the benefits of the musicians, right? So today's mechanism is actually doing a self-adjustment process that is really satisfying both sides. I believe that on one part it has been told by our upper class, but the problem is that there's another problem existing. Another part of music industry existing in today's society is that, firstly, for those pure musicians who probably compose music and play piano on concerts, they are actually the ones that their consumers do not really download this music from the society. They are gaining a kind of elite feelings that they were enjoying this kind of music in concerts by buying albums. For them, this kind of buying of albums and paying for concerts is actually a kind of collection for them. It's a kind of elite feelings that gain from this kind of entertainment and enjoyment. While for the pop stars, as being told thoroughly by the upper stars, is that they gain the money from a different perspective, from a totally different mechanisms. So both part of the music industry actually gain their ways through this kind of mechanisms, like developed by themselves by the market process, right? So in these cases, that's why many of the countries have the paid download advanced technologies that make people pay for the downloading of music. What it means is that because the spread and the free access the free access of internet today is so, the free flow of information is so advanced that people when confronting with this kind of problems that bring by the development of technology, people have already developed their own ways of solving this problem in society. What I told you is that the policy you're taking for today's government is not only not necessary but also harmful to the consumers and the musicians. Why? Because for the consumers, you're actually compensating the musicians, which they don't have the incentives to create the better music or different kinds of music to satisfy the needs of the consumer. And on the second level is that your unnecessary policy and harmful policy will actually bring harms to these musicians and to the whole development of this music industry. People don't really preview this industry as a way of commerce. They preview it as something of government responsibility. And in these cases, both sides are harmed by your policy, which they don't get their demand satisfied. And on the other hand, there's no incentive to create better music as you're supposed to propose. So we're very proud to propose.
Okay, I thank member of the opposition, and now let's have the final speaker from the government, government whip.
Mr. Speaker, I feel sorry for the people in this room. I feel sorry because the highlight of your tournament has to come in round 2. Now, as the final speaker for side government today, I'm going to be analyzing this debate on 2 main fronts. Number 1, in terms of government responsibility, whether or not the government needs to give these people recompensation. And then number 2, I'm going to analyze the effects on our music industry. And I'm going to clarify this in a very good manner, because we've just heard a very confusing speech from the member of opposition. So moving on to my first clash about government responsibility. One of the main points of analysis that we've heard from Team Opposition today is about how the government isn't culpable so that they shouldn't have to pay. Mr. Speaker, we have 3 levels of response. Number 1, my speaker Curie came up before, and she told you about how the government hasn't fulfilled its responsibility in protecting capitalism. And I'm going to talk more about that. Now, we think that in a free market society, the government allows companies and corporations to trade freely amongst each other. And the role of the government in that society is to regulate, to protect, to make sure that people are not engaged in legal activities. No, thank you, ma'am. And when somebody engages and does something that is against the regulations that are established, that's when the government intervenes and fixes the problem. We think that, Mr. Speaker, illegal downloads aren't a new trend. It's theft. It's some people doing something that is against the law. And when the government hasn't been able to protect the music industry, no, thank you, ma'am, from this kind of theft, then it is responsible. But moving on to my second level of response, Mr. Speaker, even if we do assume that the government is not culpable, we still think that when you recompensate these musicians, the government is sending out the message that it is going to protect intellectual property. Mr. Speaker, as I've already mentioned before, the opposition side tried to make out this theft as a new trend. They said that the music industry should be forced to adapt. Mr. Speaker, we don't think that that's true. This isn't a change in consumer behavior. It's not a change in people's opinions about what kind of music they think is good. It's simply people believing that they want to get this music for free, and that's why they're going into illegal activities. Mr. Speaker, we think, no thank you ma'am, that the government has a burden to protect intellectual property so that in the future, musicians and artists and other people engaging in fields of creativity still have an incentive to make things because they need to get recompensated. But the third and final level of response that I have, Mr. Speaker, no thank you ma'am, is that what you have to understand is that the vast majority of artists, musical artists, they are not famous, they are not rich, and they don't have an extremely large fan base. The sole reason and the sole way that these people can sustain their livelihoods is through selling their CDs through online downloads. And Mr. Speaker, when you cut off that main source of revenue, then these people have no other way of continuing their livelihoods. We think the government has an incentive to protect those people when they're not able to make money from their main vocation. And these are three main reasons why, no thank you ma'am, the government does have a responsibility to recompensate these individuals. But then we've heard very exclusive extensions from the closing government today about how in the long term the government has an incentive to do this so that it can fix the problems of the music industry. And the response that we heard from the opposition side was that because people paying taxes will believe that they are disadvantageous because other people are downloading music illegally, it will simply increase the amount of illegal downloads. Mr. Speaker, we have two levels of response. Number one, we think that sooner or later a tipping point will come. We think that even in the short term, people increase their illegal downloads. Sooner or later, the burden on them becomes larger. The more they engage in these illegal downloading activities, the more the government has to recompensate the artists, and sooner or later, that's more tax that people have to pay. Sooner or later, a point comes, no thank you ma'am, when the people recognize that they need to fix their ways in order to cut their losses. But the second level of response that we have, Mr. Speaker, no thank you ma'am, is that this isn't mutually exclusive. Just because the government implements this kind of policy doesn't mean that it can increase its regulations on piracy. These things can be done at both at the same time, so we don't think that any kind of specific harm is going to the status quo. And that's why this first important clash about government responsibility, the clash that wins us this debate, has been taken by the closing government today. Because we've solved this tension about government culpability, but we've also given you the exclusive analysis about why this can be solved in the long term as well. But before I move on, yes ma'am.
On governmental responsibility, your opening house said that in the status quo, the government is actually not able to use regulation to solve this problem. What we've told you is that the only solution is the organic development of the music industry, that you're actually barring by compensating these artists.
We've told you, Mr. Speaker, about how the government can strengthen regulations and do this at the same time. We don't think this is a significant matter in this debate, but we've also told you about that organic matter thing. That's just playing with words. They're saying theft in a very pretty way, and we don't think that's true. But moving on to my second clash, Mr. Speaker, about effects on the music industry. Now, something else that we've heard from Team Opposition today is about diversity, and about how they'll diversify the type of music. Mr. Speaker, we have two levels of response. Number one, under their model, in which these artists have to live with illegal downloads, what happens is that making music becomes a significant risk. Creating a piece of music, Mr. Speaker, is extremely expensive. You have to invest time in composing the music itself, you have to go to recording studios, and you have to distribute the music. No thank you ma'am. And we think that people incur massive costs when they try to make these things. But Mr. Speaker, unless their music is extremely successful, and they can hold concerts, and they get offers by major companies, then it's a complete flop, because they make no money at all from the downloads that people have made off their music. So we think that, Mr. Speaker, no thank you ma'am, it tends toward the mainstream. People won't try new ideas, they'll stick to what they think will work. And that moves on to my second level of response. You significantly raise the entrance barrier in the music industry, Mr. Speaker. Individual average Joes can no longer make music because of massive costs, no thank you ma'am. They need to tie themselves to major recording companies, they need publicity, they need sponsors, please stop barracking me ma'am. They need these things so that they can become famous at open concerts. Mr. Speaker, under their model, you eliminate all of the individual actors in the music industry who want to make music, no thank you ma'am, and you simply decrease it to a small number of major recording studios. And we don't think that's good at all, no thank you ma'am. But then something else that we've also heard from the closing opposition today is about how some of these music groups have very devoted fans that will buy albums and go to concerts. Mr. Speaker, 2 levels of response. Number 1, we think that those kinds of extremely devoted fans are the significant minority. That's why very small indie bands are niche markets. They only engage in a very small amount of the musical population, and they never get mainstream success. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, those small numbers of people won't really do anything large for these indie bands. But the second level of response that we have, Mr. Speaker, is that under their model, these small bands can never expand. They'll only have their extremely devoted fans who buy small numbers of albums day after day, but because their music on the internet is never sold, it's never recognized, the government never recompensates them, they have no way of generating the capital to gain larger stream success, Mr. Speaker. They're blocking the development of these small guys. And then finally, we've heard absolutely no response from the closing opposition on our member speaker's analysis about commercialization. She told you even more about how, Mr. Speaker, right now in the music industry, we have a girl band. We have these pretty girls in short skirts dancing to hip-hop music, Mr. Speaker, in Korea, Japan, China, and a lot of Asian music industries. We've told you about how that's going to become more widespread because people want to stick with what works and what's popular. For all these reasons, we beg to propose.
I thank Government Whip, and I call upon the final speaker of this debate, Opposition Whip.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members of the House, obviously from the propositions that actually not only this kind of proposal is not necessary in the first place, but we say that the proposal will actually bring even further harms, which was already proposed by partner, by telling that firstly, for those kind of artists themselves, when this kind of money does not directly come from those kind of taxpayers themselves, when this does not come from consumers themselves, but instead it is somehow like a kind of tax paying from the government. When the government is paying that kind of money, we think that it's hard for those kind of artists to directly derive a sense of satisfaction because they believe that, well, in the first place, their talents of music are not recognized by the consumer, but instead is purely given by the government. We say when such kind of lack of satisfaction occurs, we say it will actually de-incentivize those kind of people from producing even better music to fully actualize their individuality in this kind of music. And we say that when such kind of phenomenon occurs, it also harms the consumers. Because we see for those consumers, they still have a very strong need for such kind of good music. But we say under their proposal, they not only harm those kind of artists, but also the consumers. And basically, our stance here is very clear. But what the partner trying to show you is give you a better proposal than theirs. Instead of just simply requiring the government to give such kind of compensation, what we really advocate is to actually incentivize those kind of music producers or artists themselves to actually to be very willing to share their music with the public. It is through this process of adapting to what is exactly happening in the status quo to not only help those kind of artists to better produce the music, but also at the same time to meet the demands of this of those consumers. But how is that? We say under a big title of such kind of we say this kind of big title is called Industry Self-Optimization, which will be included, no thank you, in the 2 clashes I found in this debate. So basically, first clash in this debate is about whether it is really necessary for such kind of government to take responsibility to give such compensation. For the promising side, they believe that they can achieve 2 things at the same time. For those kind of music industries, they not only get some income from concerts or some other tours. They at the same time they still need to get some kind of compensation.
Sure.
So no thank you. So here we have to discuss the problem of proportionality. We think that under their proposal, the money those artists get has already become disproportional to what they exactly deserve. Why is that? Because in the status quo, what we already see is a main source for this kind of music producers to get money is not through the selling of albums in the first place. Instead, we see the whole branch of music industry has transformed in a style that through the widespread of such kind of music, people actually realize the popularity of such kind of artists or like music industries, and therefore they will be more willing to go to like some certain concerts to listen to what the superstars are singing, or to uphold the advertisements that their successful artists are producing. Right? But we say the main source of income for this producers to get is through the latter several processes, like the concerts and something like that. They don't really have the expectation to get so much money from the selling of albums in the first place, because we know that in the status quo, for most of the consumers, they don't really feel that it is really so necessary to buy this kind of albums, except for the super fans who still want to buy that. For most of people, what we really need is to simply take music as a way for them to achieve entertainment. In most cases, we only want to simply listen to this kind of music. We don't really want to buy it. Well, according to the proposition, they say, well, it is totally illegal. They want to protect the intellectual property rights. We say it is fine. But firstly, we don't think that their proposals are really protecting the intellectual property rights, because you actually already create a kind of dependence of this kind of artists to rely on the government to simply give the compensation. They really do not really have the kind of incentive to continue to fight for the intellectual property rights anymore, because they know that even if they do not actively fight for their intellectual property rights, the government will still function, will still provide them with money. Then what's the point of me actively engaging in such activity anymore? Mrs. Speaker, the key issue here is not to actively force those kind of taxpayers to pay money for such kind of music industry. Instead, what we really advocate is to actually encourage those kind of music producers, to encourage they themselves to be even more willing to follow what is exactly happening in the status quo, to follow such kind of trend, to actually require the artists themselves to be more willing to share their music with the public. We say, well, the proposition put forward in some cases, like for some extremely unfamous people, they urgently need the money, and they believe that it is the only way for those kind of artists is to protect their intellectual property rights, to get the money from the selling of albums. We say it is not the case. What we really advocate is to actually encourage those kind of people who are still not so famous, to encourage them to make their music products be more popular spread among people, right? When the consumers have, especially when the listeners have a better understanding of what the music is exactly about, when their music become more and more popular, especially through the spread of the government, we say, unpopular people, they can still have the chance to actually derive money from other ways, because once their music become more familiar to their listeners, we say that for those listeners, they also would be more willing to listen to the music of the products of those kind of unpopular people, to first go to the concert or to enjoy the advertisements or something like that. We think that this is exactly the best way for us to solve the problem. We don't deny the importance of intellectual property rights. We're only talking about which model can actually best solve the problem. For our side, we not only acknowledge the intellectual property rights. What we better advocate is through such kind of process of industry self-optimization, to let those industries themselves to follow the huge trend, to understand the best way to gain money through such kind of process. For the proposition, they have a misunderstanding of the nature of music. They believe that the nature of music is only about enjoying artistic value of this kind of music himself. I think it's not true. Music plays a very important role in people's appreciation of music and also their entertainment. We say, what our proposal is trying to do is to satisfy both the consumers' need for enjoying the music, but also satisfy those kind of more benefits for music, and that is the best way for us to make the benefits of both sides. So we're proud to do this.